Well, our speaker tonight is a keen observer of the ongoing battle between socialism and freedom in Latin America. She is a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal, where she writes editorial columns on Latin America, trade, and international economics. She is also editor of the weekly column The Americas, which focuses on Latin America and Canada. She is the recipient of numerous awards for her work, including the Walter Judd Freedom Award from the Fund for American Studies, the Thomas Jefferson Award from the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and the Bastiat Prize for Journalism from the International Policy Network. Would you please welcome to the podium Mary Anastasia OGrady.
Good evening. Thank you, Tim, for that very generous introduction. It's really a thrill for me to be here with Hillsdale tonight. You know, growing up in New York, all the Irish are big Notre Dame football fans. Most of those fans didn't go to the school, and a lot of them have never been out of Brooklyn. But they used to call themselves the Subway alumni, because they were so into Notre Dame football and by extension the school. That's a little bit how I feel about Hillsdale. I didn't have the privilege to attend the school, but I'm a big fan and I like to consider myself the Subway alumni. So it's really a great honor to be here tonight. Now the title of my talk is Socialism in Latin America, but that's a little vague. So I'm going to reframe it with a title, Lessons from Latin America, How the Triumph of Bad Ideas Has Poisoned the Well of Prosperity. Now, I'm always a little bit amused when I talk to Americans who don't know that much about the region, and the United States tends to look east-west, not north-south, so people generally don't know about the region. It's kind of a black box for them. But there are some fashionable explanations for Latin American underdevelopment. There are things like corruption, lack of education, poor infrastructure, and my favorite, a shortage of money, which I think is called poverty. But let's be honest, all of these things, corruption, lack of education, poor health care, infrastructure, even poverty, are symptoms of something else. And that something else is bad policy. And that policy, I think, can be best summed up by what I call the 3 Ps of populism. That is, the 3 Ps of poverty, and that is populism, protectionism, and prohibition. These are the things that we proponents of liberty often find ourselves talking about when we struggle to make things better in the region. How to open markets, how to keep politicians from making us all dependents of the state, and of course, how to change the drug laws so that organized crime doesn't keep growing and overwhelming our institutions. But I am increasingly convinced that we're still very far from the source of the troubles and the underdevelopment in Latin America when we address threats to liberty and progress in this way. The 3 Ps of poverty, populism, prohibition, and, populism, prohibition, and protectionism are but symptoms of something that I think is a much bigger problem in the region, and I think threatens liberty in the US and in Europe as well. So I ask you to focus on two things. First, to borrow a fundamental principle of classical liberals, ideas matter. And I don't mean only their existence matters, but what I mean is which ideas prevail in society, which ideas are considered legitimate and moral. Secondly, I want you to consider the fact that without entrepreneurship, without producers who make things and sell them, and in the process earn a profit, a society cannot achieve prosperity. I'm going to argue here tonight that it is bad ideas from academia and from intellectuals more broadly that have played the key role in undermining the entrepreneurial culture in Latin America over the past century. It's bad ideas that are hostile to entrepreneurship, that have moved from the intellectual sphere to government institutions, the popular culture, and society more broadly, that have eaten away at the region's promise. The ideas that hold: profits are morally and ethically suspect, ownership is not justified, self-determination is selfish. These ideas strike at the heart of all that human beings ought to hold dear: the right to the fruits of one's own labor, the right to self-discovery and self-determination, and even the right to fail. This thinking has deprived hundreds of millions of Latin Americans of the most basic human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and it has undermined their hope for prosperity. So how did this happen in Latin America? After all, the 19th century was a time of more or less classical liberalism in the region. Well, I will begin with a famous quote, and those of you who are economists in the room know it well, from John Maynard Keynes, in which he described the power and influence of intellectuals. He said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I am sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas." Now, Latin Americans didn't understand this until it was too late. And it is where we, north of the Rio Grande, too, will lose out if we don't pay attention to the importance of making the moral case for the market. Does not exist in Latin America. Latin Americans, as probably most of you know, have no problem being entrepreneurial. Immigrants to the U.S. have long histories of starting their own businesses once they've landed in the U.S. So how come this doesn't happen at home? I submit to you that it's because intellectual forces in the region have been and still are hostile to entrepreneurship. Enrique Krause is a Mexican historian. He wrote a book on the history of ideas and power in the region in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. The book is called Redeemers. The book profiles 12 individuals who Krause believes represent the major political ideas in the region from the middle of the 19th century through the 20th century. The book begins with Jose Marti and ends with Hugo Chavez. It includes profiles on Eva Perón, Che Guevara, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's a Colombian writer and friend of Castro, Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who was a Catholic bishop in the south of Mexico during the Zapatista uprising, and Subcomandante Marcos, who is also part of the Zapatista uprising in the 1990s in the south of Mexico. The overwhelming ideology of the period is collectivist. These individuals, Krause tells us, defined the most influential ideas of their time. Those ideas rose to prominence and formed the intellectual framework that then supported the region's secular institutions. Now, there were, during this whole time, risk-takers, entrepreneurs, innovators, builders, and merchants in Latin America. They were around somewhere, but it was the ideas of these guys who hated capitalism, profits, and private ownership that molded the norms and values of the laws in these countries. I should note that Krause also includes Mario Vargas Llosa and Octavio Paz in Redeemers. They're two individuals who began on the left but slowly gravitated toward classical liberalism. But they're the oddballs in the group. And I think Vargas Llosa in particular is included for his opposition to military dictatorship. The power of ideas was well understood among intellectuals on the left throughout the 20th century in Latin America. They made it their business to get control of academia, and they succeeded. And in the classroom, a new narrative emerged. It gave the moral high ground to the state and denounced the market as immoral. Millions of Latin American students have been marinated in the values of the left, of central economic planning and state redistribution. But what is more important to understand is they absorbed it not purely as economic doctrine, but as the morally legitimate framework for society. This has had a profound effect on the political climate in the region. As Krause shows in Redeemers, an intellectual movement opposed to classical liberalism, mainly because it was associated with the U.S., and he discusses the roots of that being the Spanish-American War, the U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War, and in favor of something that he calls Latin American nationalism, began to crop up in the earliest years of the 20th century. Nationalism's economic counterpart, socialism, was given a huge boost in the Great Depression. That's because the Smoot-Hawley tariffs hit the region very hard, and Latin American policymakers retaliated by closing Latin American markets. For those who had resisted nationalism and socialism until then, U.S. protectionism made it more and more difficult not to give in. Now, you may say, okay, well, but today the ideas of Che Guevara and Eva Perón are discredited. And I agree. Modern socialists, and by this I mean those who reject communism and fascism but favor collectivism in some form, do not attack private enterprise head-on. That would be suicidal because the market has created so much prosperity, and I think there's a wide recognition of that. Arthur Selden outlined just how defeated the socialists were on a practical level by the end of the 20th century in his great book, The Virtues of Capitalism. Selden, you will recall, was the brains behind the Thatcher Revolution. Here's what Selden said about the relationship between capitalism and progress. The supreme task humanity has faced down the centuries has been to discover and mobilize the abilities, talents, and genius of individuals in the creation of civilized society. The rationale and vindication of decentralized initiative, independent of the state, described popularly as private enterprise, historically as capitalism, and technically as the market economy, is that it has proved more effective with better results in living standard than any other system, from the benign mixed economy of social democracy to the rigorous centralized planning of communism. Now that's pretty tough to argue with, and the intellectuals in Latin America do not try to argue with it. They know that that would be too difficult, and it's widely recognized that the market has delivered a lot of goods. But they do not surrender. Instead, they ask young people to look not at the wealth of nations, but instead at what they call the morality, or perhaps more accurately, the immorality of the inequality produced by liberty. This issue of equality is the single most insidious ideology in the region right now. For socialism, it's the soft underbelly of the market economy. Latin America can show us what happens when the morality of the market is not defended. And here's where there are even lessons for the U.S. And this is something that you will notice if you look at Chile today, which has moved from an underdeveloped country to a developed country in 30 years. It created enormous prosperity. But even if a society makes economic gains by adopting pro-market policies, if the population is not convinced of the morality of the system that did this for them, it will say, or if it's not convinced that the system is ethical, let me put it that way, that the system is fair, that it's ethical, it will want to destroy what it has achieved, even if it has achieved great prosperity. In Chile, in the recent years, where the Communist Party has been behind student demands for free university education and claiming that those who won't give in to that demand are immoral. The behavior of the students is easy to understand. They want something for nothing. It's sort of run-of-the-mill rent-seeking. But what about the broader support that they get from Chilean society? Chile's made massive economic gains in well-being, but the society has been supporting the students. And I think this is because of the fact that the establishment has not been able to defend the market economy and to unpack the connection between entitlements and the loss of liberty. Save for a few brave intellectuals, most of the country's leadership has been back on its heels, apologizing for the market model because of the inequality. And this is Chile, the poster child of liberal ideas and values and prosperity. Outside of Chile, things are even worse. And I blame a lot of this on the link between intellectuals and constitutions. In most of the region, intellectuals bought this idea of equality as the highest goal. From their ivory towers, they brought it to big government through the region's constitutions. These constitutions, which are perpetually rewritten by academics and the intellectual elite, always strive to make state-sponsored equality the law. And of course, who can object to making the poor child equal to the wealthy entrepreneur? The problem with a constitution written with the objective of creating equality of outcomes is that it cannot guarantee individual rights. And that means that the world that Arthur Selden described, that world of glorious prosperity, is not possible. because you cannot have it both ways. Latin American constitutions are hundreds of pages long. They have objectives like guaranteeing national development, eradicating poverty and substandard living conditions, reducing social and regional inequalities, and promoting well-being. The 1988 Brazilian Constitution gave citizens the constitutional right to education, health, work, leisure, security, Social Security, protection of motherhood and childhood, and assistance to the destitute. The Constitution guaranteed rights to minimum salaries, year-end bonuses, overtime, and vacation pay. It guaranteed free assistance for children and dependents from birth to 6 years of age in daycare centers and preschool facilities. The culture section of the 1988 Brazilian Constitution charged the government with protecting Brazil's cultural heritage by means of inventories, registers, vigilance, monument protection decrees, expropriation, and other forms of precaution and preservation. In the section dedicated to sports, yes, there's a section dedicated to sports in the Brazilian Constitution. It specified that the government shall encourage leisure as a form of social promotion. If you look at the unemployment rate, I think they're doing a pretty good job. Now, if you think about all this enshrined in the Constitution, you can easily see that the government has not only the power, but the obligation to use coercion to reach its goals. This is the fundamental cause of Latin American underdevelopment. There's a lack of liberty of the kind Arthur Selden describes, which emanates from constitutional mandates aimed at equality, not under the law, but equality of outcomes, which intrude on every aspect of human action. Now, let me just say one quick thing about special interests, because I do not hold them blameless, even though Keynes kind of downplayed their importance. What I've been describing here originates with the intellectual class, but it's also clear that these ideas might not have gained so much influence if not for the business and community's enthusiasm to join in the game. Isn't that always what happens? Its interests were, of course, purely pragmatic. Let's take Venezuela. The 1961 Venezuelan Constitution was, by most accounts, a reasonably sound document. But that didn't mean that factions, as Madison might have called them, didn't have reason to try to pick it apart. And they did. For 40 years, the Constitution was under assault, particularly private property. Of course, the left wanted to undermine the rule of law and property rights, but the business community helped. Here's what the late Venezuelan journalist Carlos Ball wrote about the slow deterioration of property rights in the 1961 Constitution. This is a quote. "Many in the business community did not rebel against growing state intrusion because they saw it was easier to convince one cabinet minister than a market of consumers." I'll never forget watching Venezuelan businessmen cheering the nationalization of foreign oil companies, not realizing that the politicians would soon come after them with more controls, regulations, and taxes. And as we know, the government of Hugo Chavez and now Nicolás Maduro subsequently has done much worse. So I'll just conclude by saying when the state gets the moral high ground in matters of personal decisions and property rights, there is no end to the steps it will take to contain liberty in the name of social justice and equality. Once this happens, standards of living will necessarily decline. Thank you. We're going to take questions.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Grady. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you.
Thank you. How does religion affect economics in Latin America?
Well, let's take Cuba, for example. There is no religion in Cuba. It's an atheist state. The communist government actually worked to outlaw religion in 1959 when they took over. So in a case like Cuba, I guess you could say that there were certain members of the church that tried to fight back during the revolution. They were either killed or exiled. So at this point, it doesn't really have much of an effect. The church has been trying to get back into Cuba, in my opinion, making too many concessions to the regime, but with the idea that they would have a chance to have some open spaces and minister. In Venezuela, the church has been very strong against Chavez and Maduro, they have openly been fighting with the regime. Last Good Friday, a bunch of thugs working for the regime burst into the cathedral and started beating people up. So there you have a big conflict between the church and the government. It's hard for me to just sort of do a blanket statement about the whole region. I mean, there's more competition in religion than there was 100 years ago in Latin America. There's the evangelical churches have made big inroads, but it hasn't seemed to make a big difference. I mean, there's quite a bit of competition in Central America between the church and Protestant denominations in Central America, but it hasn't changed the politics very much. There is a theory held by, most famously Max Weber, that the Protestant colonies developed better than the Catholic colonies because of Catholic views of economics and development. But I'm not entirely convinced of that theory. A very good book to read on that is Empire of the Atlantic, which talks about the similarities and differences between the U.S. and Latin America during colonial times. I guess I'll say one other thing, which is liberation theology, which was a Catholic was a let's see, was a Catholic idea, but not sanctioned by the church. In Central America, I think was very bad for the region, and because the liberation theologists backed Marxism, basically. And so I think pretty early on, John Paul II spoke out against liberation theology and sanctioned those priests. But there's one theory that says that the Catholic Church has a more collectivist view of the world. But if you read the scholastics, I don't think that's true. So it's open to interpretation, and it's rather long discussion. But anyway, I hope that helps a little bit.
I'm sure you know about Francisco Marroquin University in Guatemala. I'm just wondering if you've seen any influence from that school, which is very much a free market school, sort of an anomaly in Central America. Have you seen much influence from that school in the region?
Thank you. It's kind of interesting because I think the idea of the founders of the Marroquin is a university in Central America founded in the 1970s by a guy who saw the kinds of problems I described here with academia, basically the left controlling all of academia. He started this university. Wonderful, amazing place. Full disclosure, I have an honorary doctorate from them. But they've done a fantastic job. They have not yet had an influence, and I think if you talk to the people from the university, they will say that the idea of the university is to develop the human capital so that when the opportunity is there, like what happened in Chile in 1973, I mean, if you go back to Chile in 1973, the University of Chicago had already been working with Catholic University in Santiago for many, many years. Ted Schultz, I think, was the originator of that idea, and Arnold Harberger was working there. So they had the human capital in place. So when Pinochet came along, he basically told the technocrats, look, I'm here to defeat communism, but I don't know anything about the economy. And then he kind of let them put in place the things, but they had the human capital that they needed. So the idea of the Marroquin is to create that human capital. Thus far, it seems like most of the Marroquin graduates are very entrepreneurial, so they don't go into government. But I think that's the long-term hope in Guatemala, that they're sort of developing that over time.
Thank you. Your comment about the intellectuals of the last 100, 120 years, I think is right on, and I think we, the developed world, exported that with the progressives. But I'd like you to address just the absolute chaos when they threw off the Spanish yoke, the authoritarianism of the Spanish rulers that built no civil institutions. Doesn't that play a more significant role, in my mind, than you give it credit for, to what's going on with this authoritarian viewpoint in society now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. I guess the reason why I don't give it as much play as you're suggesting is because if you look country by country through the region, there are glimpses of institution building and moments when, let's take Argentina, for example, has a very big British influence, and it had institutions at one time. Those institutions didn't hold up, and I have spent the last 25 years of my life trying to figure out why they cannot build institutions. I mean, because that's precisely what they need. I agree with you. But there are two problems with blaming the 16th century. And one of them is that you never get out of the problem. You know, we're here now and we're trying to figure out how do we build institutions. And every time you try to build the institute, like you try to write a new constitution, you end up with a mess. You end up with a 400-page document and with all these kinds of privileges. And so why can't we build institutions? I mean, we can't erase those 400 years. This is where we are. So what I'm trying to discuss here is why the Constitution grows out of the norms and values of a culture. And, you know, the United States has a lot to be proud of, but we can also say that we had many moments in time when we were just lucky. And so with that luck and the right institutions, we made it through that period of underdevelopment to development. So part of the problem is that development takes a long time, and I think sometimes we expect it to happen too fast. But I think fundamentally, at the very core of it is, why don't people hang on to the things that are in place? Why do they let go of them so quickly when they hit a bump in the road? And I think that has to do with the norms and values of the culture. And I think that those come about through the ideas of the intellectuals and academia. I mean, in Venezuela, if you talk to Venezuelans, they will tell you that the left was sort of threatening in the way that the hard left was threatening the country since the 1960s. So what the politicians decided to do was say, okay, you know what we'll do? We'll just give them education, get them out of our hair. We can go back over here and have all the other ministries. We'll just let them over there and not pay attention to them. Well, of course, precisely where they shouldn't have been. And I think, like I said, I've spent 25 years looking at this. I really think that if there's any hope for the region to change, it has to be through the education. And when I say education, I'm not talking about reading and writing, because the left does that. I mean, Cuba is one of the most literate places in the world. It has to be through the fostering of these kinds of ideas in the culture. And that just doesn't exist in the region. It's very rare. Vargas Llosa is an exception.
Over here.
Oh, sorry. I'm disoriented.
It's good to hear you speak again. I saw you speak at Hillsdale. I think the last time this conference was offered there on that campus maybe 10, 12 years ago. And over the last 2 days, we've now heard 3 speakers speak against free trade. And I know Hillsdale has this great tradition, even on their material, of defending liberty since 1844. So I ask you, do you think personal liberty is aligned with free trade? Or is it okay if we set free trade aside and have some America First policy?
Well, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, protectionism is one of the 3 Ps of poverty. And you can trace the impoverishment, both material impoverishment and intellectual impoverishment in Latin America, to Smoot-Hawley in the 20th century. And the reverse is also true. You know, one of the most successful countries in the region in the last 10 years is probably Peru. You don't hear much about it. It was a very poor country. It was ravaged by the Shining Path. But the one thing that Alberto Fujimori did when he came in the 1990s was he opened the markets. I mean, dramatically. And for any of you who read Spanish, there's a very good book by Jaime de Altaus called The Capitalist Revolution, all about the way Peru changed when they opened markets there. And you know, when you watch this big wave of left-wing populism that occurred after Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, and you think about the countries that it hit in the region, it did not hit Peru. Peru even elected a very left-wing guy by the name of Ollanta Humala, that people were terrified this guy was going to be another Chavez, but he wasn't. And I think the big difference is that Peru is a very open economy, as is Chile, which continued to grow even through this coalition that Michelle Bachelet had with the Communist Party. And the reason is because of the openness. So, I mean, you asked me, your question was sort of whether I think your question had a moral component to it, which is, do people have the right to free exchange? And of course, I believe they do. But just from a policy and development point of view, I think opening markets is one of the probably the single most important thing that can be done, because you don't just get the trade of goods, but you get the exchange of ideas. And that certainly explains why Mexico has done so well, not in its GDP growth, but in the changes that it's gone through since 1994, basically a bloodless revolution, you know, bringing down the PRI and converting to a democracy and so forth. I think a lot of that is explained by NAFTA.
I have 2 questions, one personal and one futuristic. The personal one is, where are you from originally?
I was born in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Pero se habla español, no?
Excuse me?
I think, yes. The futuristic question is, where and when do you think an American-style republic or society will take root in Latin America first?
Well, that's kind of a trick question, because when you say American style, I mean, can I go with just a prosperous society as opposed to American style? Because I'm not so sure the American style is going to fit anywhere. Every country is going to kind of come up with their own ideas. For example, if you think about Ireland, Ireland was a very poor country and was a Catholic country, two things that supposedly Latin Americans are told they can't overcome because they're Catholic and they're poor and they're going to be stuck like that forever. But Ireland has changed a lot. So when you say American style, I mean, Ireland is a parliamentary government, but I think you're talking about property rights and the rule of law and so forth. You have that somewhat in Chile. And I would say the other country that I'm going out on a limb here, but somewhat optimistic about, providing that that our current occupant of the White House doesn't undo NAFTA, I think Mexico is promising. I think, a lot of the stuff you don't hear about it because the war on drugs has kind of like overwhelmed the news. But they've done some very serious reforms in telecommunications and in energy that show they're serious about property rights. And they're also a very open economy at this point. I mean, if Donald Trump decides that he doesn't want to do business with Mexico, they're going to start doing more trade with countries like Argentina and Brazil. They're very committed to that model. So a lot can happen. They have an election next year, and it's possible that Lopez Obrador could win that election because they do not have a runoff. So all he has to do is have a majority, and he could win, and that would be bad for the progress of the country. I don't think it would entirely set it back the way things have been set back in Venezuela, but it would be bad for the development. But those are probably, I think, the two most promising places.
First of all, I love your column, and non-subscribers to the WSJ should subscribe to the WSJ to read you. But second, I want to kind of push the question of the relationship between religion and the free market. If you're a JP2 or Benedict Roman Catholic, then you can look at those popes and say, follow them and have economic prosperity. I'm a Protestant, so I don't have a dog in the hunt. But as an observer, I would say that that's not the same with Pope Francis. And so if Roman Catholics in South America especially are looking to an Argentine Pope to give guidance, wisdom, and counsel about economic policy, we have somebody who in Laudato Si actually railed against the horrors of air conditioning. So could you give this is kind of a follow-up to the first question of, what should Roman Catholics in South America think about their Pope vis-a-vis economics, and what does it say about the prospects for the region in terms of economic growth with our current Pope? Thank you.
Well, I keep telling myself that the Holy Spirit had something in mind when he chose this Pope. It's one thing we Catholics call a mystery, another mystery. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think this Pope has not been good for the region. He's not been good for Cuba. I think I mentioned that before. On the ground, though, I think there's something different, like in Venezuela. I mean, I think the Venezuelan bishops have really stood up. I think they came to the game late. And basically, most Catholic clergy over the years, in my lifetime anyway, have not been very good economists. Yeah, I think, this Pope in particular, I would say, is an example of what I was talking about in terms of the morality issue, because you can make all the arguments you want about producing wealth and so forth. But if underneath it people think that somehow the system is unethical, they'll end up destroying it. And so I would have to agree that he's not good for the region. But But I also know that, for example, if you take a country like Colombia, I mean, this is I don't think the government there is particularly religious. You know, I mean, Catholicism is sort of a nominal religion in most of these countries at this point. And there's also a very strong wing of Orthodox Catholics, particularly in places like Chile, but throughout the region. Those people tend to be very free market. So there's a little bit of a tug-of-war going on there. That's the best I can say without getting excommunicated.
It's the teacher again. I'm over here.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's the teacher again. I've learned from my students that there is sort of a caste system, that from Mexico, they think they are better than the Hondurans, who think they're better than the El Salvadorians. Now, I may have that just reversed, but the Mexicans think they are hot stuff. And then you go down and they think the other groups are not as good. Is this based on the economy and the progress that had been made in the countries as far as economics is concerned?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, basically, Mexico, if you look at from a point of view of the World Bank, is a middle-income country at this point. It's not a poor country. And most of Central America, I don't know, Nicaragua is an extremely poor country. So yeah, I think that the pecking order goes exactly like that in terms of which countries are richer, and those children from those countries feel like they're better off. I had a friend who taught in the Los Angeles school system, and she said that, she told me that the Guatemalan children tried to pretend they were Mexican because that was, you know, something considered more high class.
Hi. I don't know a ton about this region, and so I was talking to my friend in the history department who is an expert on Latin America, and I was talking to him about capitalism and socialism, and he said, well, you know, the legacy there is the Dole Company coming in coercively to take. And so I was wondering, how much of a role does a weird, cronyistic, coercive version of capitalism that has sometimes occurred played in maybe the hatred of that system?
Well, gosh, that's a pretty big, broad question. One of the problems with something like the Dole Company was just that, and this happened with the Panama Canal also, is that the Americans who went to work there generally had better living conditions than the local people who were hired. So there grew up a lot of resentment, and like I said, that happened a lot with the Panama Canal. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that in some of these areas in the region, and of course the story of Dole goes way back, but if you fast forward to today and you look at, like, for example, some of the mining companies that have tried to do mining in Central America, where there's very rich veins of minerals, and mining was the thing that was the engine that basically began to pull Chile. I mean, afterwards they did all kinds of things, but mining was really the beginning of it. And what does mining require? It requires a lot of investment. So companies go in and they do mining. But in a lot of these towns for example, in Central America, they still live in a very tribal fashion. I mean, there are indigenous people, and there's a hierarchy. And if you all of a sudden go in there with investment and you start hiring people and they get jobs and they have money, they don't have the same necessary loyalty to the head of the tribe. They basically get freedom because they start to get economic wealth. And that's one of the reasons why foreign investment is resented a lot, because it changes the power structure in these small towns. So that's just one example. I mean, there's a lot of different examples of what foreign companies do when they go in there. Sometimes they're not good stewards of the property, but in many other cases they are, but they're resented because they change the dynamics of the political economy.
We have time for one more question.
The United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union then, had a greater influence on Latin America and South America, both positive and negative as far as the United States is concerned. What do you think the negative that the United States has contributed to the demise of those countries, and surely the no existence of the Soviet Union that it played before?
So the question is, what are the negatives of the U.S. policy in Latin America?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, during the Cold War, basically the U.S. position was that the U.S. had a right and a reason to keep the Soviets out of our backyard. And so I guess the negative would be that we, at some times, trying to think, well, sometimes we were viewed as being on the side of a dictator. And that probably was the case in Nicaragua because Somoza was our friend. But in the end, we ended up pulling support from Somoza and basically helping Ortega, and something similar to that happened in El Salvador. But I think the biggest negative that the U.S. has played in the region in the last 100 years has been the war on drugs, or the last 70 years has been the war on drugs. And I say this purely from an economic standpoint. I mean, there's a huge demand for drugs in this country. There's a prohibition on drugs, which means, by definition, all of those billions of dollars have to go into the pockets of criminals. They go into the pockets of criminals in very poor countries who then can use that money to basically buy and overwhelm the institutions. There's no way that you can build institutions in that environment. There isn't. I mean, a lot of people, you look at that and you say, well, is the answer legalizing drugs? I don't know what the answer is. I'm just telling you that from a practical standpoint, our policy of consuming huge amounts of drugs and then keeping the prohibition on it is, by definition, feeding huge transnational organized crime in Central America, and it's one of the big barriers to development.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Grady.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.